Winnipeg is known for a lot of things. It's the heart of the prairies, it's home to incredible culture, and it's a city that has always punched above its weight. But if you peel back the layers of history, there's one story that stands out as maybe the biggest scandal the city has ever seen. It was a moment that divided families, split neighborhoods, and put Winnipeg in the national spotlight for all the wrong reasons. Some people called it a fight for justice. Others saw it as dangerous, even revolutionary. And while more than a century has passed, the shadows of this scandal still hang over the city. This is the story of the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919. What happened, why it mattered, and why so much of it felt like something people didn't want you to know. To really understand this scandal, you have to picture Winnipeg in the years just after World War I. The city was booming in some ways, but it was also boiling over with tension. Thousands of soldiers had just returned home from the war, looking for jobs that simply weren't there. Immigrants, many from Eastern Europe, were working long hours for low wages, often in unsafe conditions. At the same time, a small group of business elites, sometimes called the Citizens Committee of 1000, had a huge amount of control over the city's wealth and politics. The gap between the working class and the powerful was wider than ever, and resentment was growing every single day. By May of 1919, workers had had enough. The spark came when building and metal trade workers tried to negotiate for better wages and collective bargaining rights. When talks broke down, they walked off the job. But what happened next shocked everyone. One by one, other unions joined in. Streetcar operators, postal workers, telephone operators, factory laborers, even police officers. Within days, more than 30,000 workers across Winnipeg had gone on strike. For 6 long weeks, the city was at a standstill. No mail, no streetcars, no factories, just silence, picket lines, and tension hanging heavy in the air. To the workers, this was about fairness. They wanted better pay, safer working conditions, and the right to organize. But to the business elites, politicians, and newspapers of the time, this was something far more sinister. They painted the strike as a threat to democracy itself. They called it a Bolshevik plot, linking it to the Russian Revolution that had happened just 2 years earlier. Fear was spreading faster than facts, and many Winnipeggers who weren't directly involved started to worry that their city was on the edge of chaos. The scandal deepened when the federal government stepped in. Instead of trying to calm tensions, Ottawa made moves that only poured gasoline on the fire. They sent in the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and a large number of special constables to control the city. They also changed immigration laws so they could deport foreign agitators, a move clearly aimed at silencing immigrant leaders of the strike. Newspapers were filled with headlines warning people about outside influences, but in reality, many of the strike leaders were Canadian-born. Still, the narrative stuck, and the government used it to justify harsh crackdowns. Things came to a head on June 21st, 1919, a day that would go down in Winnipeg history as Bloody Saturday. Strikers had gathered peacefully to protest, but tensions were high. The police and special constables moved in, and the protests turned violent. Mounties charged the crowd on horseback, swinging clubs. Shots were fired. When the dust settled, 2 men were dead, dozens were injured, and hundreds were arrested. The image of mounted police riding into a crowd of unarmed workers burned itself into the memory of the city. For many, this was the moment that turned a labor dispute into a full-blown scandal. In the aftermath, the strike collapsed. Leaders were jailed, workers were forced back on the job, and the Citizens Committee claimed victory. But the way it was handled left deep scars. Families who had participated were blacklisted from jobs. Immigrants were unfairly targeted and labeled as dangerous outsiders. Politicians in Ottawa and Winnipeg brushed off the grievances of tens of thousands of people, framing the strike as reckless rather than righteous. And for decades, the official narrative minimized what had really happened. That's where the scandal lies. It wasn't just that the strike happened, it was how it was portrayed, how it was crushed, and how the voices of ordinary people were silenced. The newspapers of the time didn't tell the full story. The government didn't want to admit that inequality and exploitation were at the heart of it. And so, for years, the Winnipeg General Strike lived in half-truths and quiet whispers. passed down in families rather than written openly in history books. Over time, though, the truth started to resurface. Historians dug into the archives, survivors shared their stories, and people began to see the strike not as a threat to democracy, but as one of the most important labor movements in Canadian history. It was messy, it was painful, and it ended in bloodshed, but it also laid the foundation for future labor rights across the country. In that sense, the scandal of 1919 was also a turning point. Out of injustice came awareness, and out of silence came a legacy that still matters today. Walking through Winnipeg today, you can still see traces of it. The streets where crowds once gathered, the old buildings where speeches were given. Even the Exchange District, now full of cafes and galleries, still holds echoes of the picket lines. And every year, people come together to remember the strike, not as a simple story of winners and losers, but as a reminder of how ordinary people stood up against power and how hard those in power fought back. So when we talk about the biggest scandal in Winnipeg's history, it's not just about the strike itself. It's about the way it was framed, the way people were treated, and the way truth was buried under fear. It's about how a city that prided itself on community was torn apart, and how those wounds still shape conversations today. Because what happened in 1919 wasn't just a Winnipeg story. It was a Canadian story, and it's one that deserves to be told in full. Whether you see it as a labor uprising, a political scandal, or simply a desperate cry for fairness, the Winnipeg General Strike remains the kind of story that defines a city. It's proof that history isn't always neat and tidy, and that sometimes the things people don't want you to know are the things you most need to hear.